So hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of UAE-ISRAEL Highway webinar. Today we will be speaking to you about the way to conduct business in Israel. This webinar is brought to you by Hamdan Al-Shamsi Lawyers and Legal Consultants and GKH Law Offices.
Thanks, Ines. أيها السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله والسلام لنا جميعا بإذن الله. اسمي ران بن أغي وأرحب بكم من مكتب المحامين GKH إلى هذا الويبينار الذي تتعرفون به على القيام بالبزنس في إسرائيل. نتمنى أن تؤدي هذه المقابلة في زوم إلى تحقيق التعاون المثمر الناجح بيننا، وسنفتح الأبواب على مصراعيها للتعاون المتبادل. وأشكر شكراً جزيلاً زملائنا الكرام من مكتب حمدان الشمسي للمحاماة على استقبالهم بنا إلى هذا الويبينار. وكما قال رئيس أنور السادات رحمه الله، إن السلام ليس توقيعاً على سطور مكتوبة، بل أنه كتابة جديدة للتاريخ. فلنعمل على تبادل العلاقات بيننا تأييداً لهذا المسار التاريخي ألا وهو اتفاق إبراهيم. وبما أن زملائي أيال وإيتاي لا ينطقون بعض بالعربية، فنستعمل اللغة الإنجليزية. شكراً.
Thank you, Ran, for this amazing introduction. So today we will be hearing from key speakers who have first-hand experience on the Israeli and Emirati market. Dr. Ayal Shenhav, head of GKH iTech and Venture Capital Practice, and a member of the firm's executive committee. Dr. Shenhav represents many startups, venture capital funds, and multinational companies. He is an adjunct professor in several leading academic institutions in Israel and is ranked as a leading expert by many international guides, as well as moderator Mohammed Yassin of counsel at Hamdan Al-Shamsi Lawyers and Legal Consultant, who is an Emirati bilingual lawyer, UK qualified with a comprehensive international education and experience. Mohammed specializes in banking and finance, corporate governance, commercial law, and immigration practices. Responsible for most of our cross-border transactions, he currently heads our Israeli and Serbian desk. With the participation as well of Itai Shai, partner at GKH Law Offices, specializes in technology and venture law. He is also a mentor at various accelerators, including NASDAQ for Israeli Arab entrepreneurs, and will be here to answer all your questions. Without further ado, let's begin this webinar on how to conduct business in Israel.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you, Ron. And, thank you, everyone, for joining. We are very blessed to have this opportunity to explain to our audience the basic steps of and basic considerations on how to do business in Israel. Dr. Ayal, we are blessed to have you with us. We would like to start basically if you could give us a brief description about GKH and a brief history of Israel.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, and thank you, Ines. This is a very exciting moment for all of us at GKH. I'm really excited to do business together and to meet each other, even though virtually. I'm sure we'll meet physically quite soon. And thank you everyone for joining. I will, with your permission, share screen with a short presentation we have prepared. Okay, so this is a very quick slide about myself. I've been a lawyer for about 30 years, and I was educated in Israel and in the United States. And I've been, as a highlight, I've been doing high-tech work for many years, both as a practitioner and as a professor in the university in Israel. My partner, Ran Ben Ari, is on the line and has also been a practitioner for many years and more focused on M&A transactions, antitrust, competition law, structured finance, and corporate law. And obviously these slides, by the way, will be available if you wish. We're happy to share them with the participants. And my third partner, Itai Shai, he's also a high-tech practitioner, representing many leading startups in Israel. And you see some more information about him on the slides. Our firm, GKH, is one of the leading law firms in Israel. We are about 170 lawyers. We're about 250 employees. And we pride ourselves as being a one-stop shop with the full range of high-quality legal services in practice areas which are needed for our clients. So we give the client all the legal services he needs. And you see a list of the areas we practice: high-tech, venture capital, corporate law, capital markets, both locally and international, M&A, banking, insurance, and the list goes on. And I don't want to go through all the list. I want to highlight that we have a China desk, we have a Singapore desk, actually headed by Ran, and a UK desk actually headed by Itai. And hopefully now we'll have a Emirates desk, and we can know more and more about how to do business together. We represent many governmental companies, including, for example, the Israeli water company called Mekorot, the Israeli ports, the Israeli railroads. We represent many public companies which are traded on NASDAQ and Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. We represent many multinationals which operate in Israel, many foreign companies which have a business in Israel. We do a lot of venture capital work. I personally, this is my main focus of practice, formation of venture capital funds and representing venture capital funds and investors. And we do have a lot of startup companies in our office in all stages, from seed to exit, and very diversified technologies. And obviously, we're well recognized by international rankings, such as Chambers, such as Legal 500, as a top law firm in Israel in our various practice areas. So this is kind of a high-level overview of our firm. And with your permission, this is some logos. These are some logos of respective clients. You will see, for example, the banks of Israel, which we represent, and many leading Israeli and international companies. And we also, I want from here to move maybe to a very short overview of Israeli history. And it's not a very long history. It's Israel became an independent state in 1948. It's a very remarkable history and very remarkable story, because in 1948, Israel had a population of only 600,000 people. And the economy in 1948 was quite small, and it was agriculturally oriented, or maybe some small factories. And over the last 72 years, Israel has grown tremendously. And now the population is approximately 9 million people. So it's a huge growth over the years. A lot of it through immigration of people from all over the world, which came to Israel as part of the Jewish diaspora. And today our country is 9 million and growing. This led to a transition in the Israeli economy, which started, I think one of the major years is 1992. In 1992, we had a new government formed by the late Yitzhak Rabin, and this government undertook to privatize the Israeli economy, and they started selling many government-owned companies. And over the years, many government companies are now privately owned. For example, the Israeli Airlines, El Al, the Israeli phone company, and so on. They're all privately held companies now. What also happened in 1992, which is a very important event, is that the government decided to invest in high-tech and startups and to help the Israeli economy to become more startup and high-tech oriented. And this is another topic. We can talk a lot about how that happened, but at the end of the day, today in 2020, after 30 years, we became a leading country in startups and technology, often called or nicknamed the Startup Nation, because of so many startups coming out of Israel. And we now have more venture capital and more startups per capita than any other country in the world. And by absolute numbers, Israel is probably either number 1 or number 2 in Europe in the number of startups and the amount of investment in Israel every year. So we have as much money coming into Israel from all over the world as much bigger countries. We are number 1 in Europe, bigger than Germany, bigger than France, bigger than Spain, bigger than Italy. We are in the same place, more or less, with the UK, which is also a very strong economy. So it's been a very remarkable history, and we're very proud of what we accomplished. But obviously, I think this is just the beginning, and we look forward to the next step. And I think the Emirates will be a big part of the second the second part of the Israeli history. I would like to spend two or three minutes on the Israeli ecosystem. And the word ecosystem, just like in the nature, in order to have a successful environment, a successful high-tech practice, we need a lot of things to work together. And in Israel, we're very fortunate that over these 30 years that I mentioned, we were able to really get together a lot of players, which together created this so-called ecosystem, which includes founders, which are hardworking and talented and have a dream how to change the world. We have very strong employees coming out of the army and coming out of the academic institutions with very good training. We have world-class academic institutions teaching people computers and engineering and many other disciplines which are needed for successful high-tech companies. We have many dozens of hubs, accelerators and incubators which help young startups to begin. We have angels, which are individuals which invest in startups. We have a lot of venture capital funds, as I mentioned before. We have over 50 or even more venture capital funds located in the Tel Aviv area where I'm sitting right now, which fund startups, and also many funds from all over the world which follow the Israeli market. We have very strong government support of our high-tech sector, with giving grants to innovative startups. And we have over 350 multinationals which have their offices in Israel. These includes many of the big names everybody knows, such as Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, IBM, but it's not just US companies, it's also companies from China, companies from Japan, companies from Germany. So we're very blessed to have multinationals from all over the world operate in Israel and help our economy. Last but not least, I hope the lawyers, accountants, and other service providers are also part of the ecosystem and give a contribution to the success of these companies. And over 30 years, it's been a significant and really great ride for the country. And I was fortunate to be part of this for the last 30 years.
Thank you, Dr. Eyal. This was very insightful, and I can already see that there's a lot of similarities. If you would kindly let us know a little bit about the opportunities to the extent the explanation about the ecosystem is finished. But please go ahead.
So there are a few more slides about the ecosystem, but I will move on. And just maybe this slide I think is always interesting for people who do not come from Israel. These are some innovations or inventions that came out of Israel: the cherry tomato, the disc on key. This is a company called Mobileye, which was sold to Intel for $15 billion, which developed safety for our car, which alerts us before an accident. Drip irrigation, which is developed in Israel. I'm sure it's very important for countries with a desert climate. The solar panels, which I'm sure is also very important for countries with a lot of sun. So these are all things that came out of Israel and Israeli innovation and became world-class products. I'm moving on, but to talk a little about the opportunities in Israel. So we try to think what are the big opportunities for investors from the United Arab Emirates in Israel. And I think there are actually a lot of opportunities, and I'm putting in the slide a few of the reasons why we think this is such a big opportunity. Number one, as you can see from my previous things I said before, Israel is very open and receptive for foreign investment. People in Israel are used to having foreign shareholders, doing transactions with foreigners, so it's a very open economy. Many Israeli companies have been sold to multinational companies, so it's not a new thing that now we will have new investors coming in. We're very used to having investors and multinationals from all over the world set up their offices in Israel. English proficiency is very high. Actually, most of our practice in our office, in the high-tech practice at least, is in English. And many of our lawyers actually were educated and trained in the United States, like myself. So we're very strong in English, and we do a lot of international transaction. So I think it's very open, and people will find it very accommodating. And I think the the good story is that there's a lot of technology here in many, many relevant sectors. If it's water tech, if it's cyber tech, if it's agri-tech, any sector or every vertical you can think of, usually Israeli technology will be a part of it. And I think Israel is, the Israeli culture is people want to move forward quickly. They want to get the deal done. So if there's a match, a deal will happen quickly. And last but not least, obviously the geographical proximity, I think is going to be a key factor. It's a very short flight from Israel to United Arab Emirates. I understand there are going to be many, many direct flights in a few months. So it'll be very easy to come to Tel Aviv or visit Israel. And obviously it will be very easy to come to visit you. So we think all of these together create a lot of opportunities for investors from the Emirates to come to Israel.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. I guess the next question is people would want to know is about the process of investment in Israel. Would you mind giving us a little bit of taking us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think the system is relatively straightforward, and people who are doing transactions in other countries will come to Israel and find it easy to do business in Israel. Easy to do business because, as I said, usually the documents are all in English, so it's very easy to conduct business in English language. Our Israeli corporate law is based on US and UK precedents, and basically the same concepts that you would learn in universities in the UK and the US would apply to investment in Israel, shareholders, directors, company corporate governance. So it's very similar to what you would know in other countries. The very good news is that Israel is an open economy and we don't have any foreign currency limitations. So people investing in Israel can convert money and take it back to their home country without any limitations, without any fees. The Israeli banking system is very modern, and so that's a very good factor. The other point, which I think is very good and very promising, is that Israel decided in 2009 not to impose any capital gain tax on foreign investors in Israel. So even if we don't have a tax treaty, and currently we don't have a tax treaty with the United Arab Emirates, I'm sure there will be a tax treaty in the near future, but now there is no tax treaty. But nevertheless, even though we don't have a treaty, still investors will not be subject to tax on capital gains when they sell their shares or sell the investment. So it's very good. There is a tax on dividend and interest, which is 25%. If there will be a treaty, it will likely be reduced to a much lower rate. Usually it would be something between 5 to 10%. But I think most of the investors, especially in the high tech, their main strategy is to get a capital gain. And the good news is that there is no capital gain tax in Israel. And last but not least, in Israel, at least if you invest in the high-tech sector, the regulation is not very heavy. If you invest in other sectors, if you invest in the banking sector or in the insurance sector or other kind of sectors, it may be more regulated. My colleague Ran is an expert in these issues, but in the high-tech sector, generally speaking, there is not much regulation. If I compare it to other countries, so people from the Emirates can come in and invest in the Israeli companies and not subject themselves to too much scrutiny and regulation. I just want to add a few more points about what it means to be an investor in an Israeli company or to form an Israeli company if any of the participants want to form a subsidiary in Israel. So I think there's a lot of good news on this one. Number one, the Israeli company have only one shareholder. You don't need to have more than one shareholder. This shareholder can be wholly owned, the Israeli company can be wholly owned by foreign residents. So a resident from the Emirates can set up an Israeli company and be the sole shareholder. There's no need, like in some countries, to have local shareholders. Also on the board level, all the directors can be foreign. You don't need to have Israeli local directors. Again, some countries in Europe require local directors. In Israel, we don't need it. Everybody can be a foreign director. And the last point, which is also important, there's no minimum equity. So even if you want to set up a company and initially invest a small amount, it's fine. And there's no minimum of, say, $100,000 or some other minimum, which is often imposed in other countries. So overall, it's quite easy to set up an Israeli company and to operate in Israel. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ayal. And in terms of the M&A sector, the transactions involving an Israeli target, I think this will be the perfect opportunity to tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Just one minute before, I may have forgot to mention, in Israel, the transactions of venture capital transactions that we do, many transactions in our office every year of venture capital, are very similar to what investors would find in the US, in the UK. So all the rights which are provided to investors, all the protection which is often provided to protect investors in US Delaware companies, we would give the same rights and the same protection to investors in Israel. So I think it's a very big opportunity. I'm skipping to the M&A question, which is very, very important. In Israel, every year in the high-tech sector, we have approximately 140 or sometimes even more M&A transactions, about 140 Israeli companies which are sold to foreign investors. So it's a very big number. And by the way, these transactions provide several billion US dollars in income or profit to the investors. And an M&A transaction in Israel is, as you can expect, is very similar to what you would find in other countries. It can be in one of three major forms. Sometimes it may be different, but these are the main three forms, probably covering over 90% of the transactions. So either all the shareholders will sell their shares to the buyer, or the company will sell off its assets to the buyer, or there will be a merger between the Israeli company and a foreign buyer. And due to tax reasons, most of the transactions will be done in the form of sale of shares, because when you sell shares, there's only one tax, which is a capital gain tax on the shareholders. And as I mentioned before, there's an exemption. So in case of sale of shares, there'll be no Israeli tax on foreign investors. If we do an asset transaction, there may be an Israeli tax on the sale of assets. So in most cases, the transaction will be in the form of an asset, shareholders sale of the shares. The process itself is obviously quite streamlined. It takes several months. There's a process of due diligence, checking the target, making sure that everything is in line and everything is, all the contracts are signed, and there's no problems in the target with the intellectual property and so on. But once you finish the due diligence, there's a purchase agreement which is drafted and negotiated, which is quite similar to what you would find in US purchase agreement, representations, covenants, indemnities, escrows, the typical things. And the process would take anywhere between, I would say, 2 to 4 months, depending on how quickly the parties resolve their issues. One of the issues which people should be aware of is that in some transactions, after the transaction, the Israeli company is acquired, the buyer wants to take the intellectual property outside of Israel to move it to another jurisdiction. This would be a taxable event. So people have to take that into account when they factor in the transaction, the price they want to pay. They need to understand that there's a potential cost on the second leg of taking the IP out of Israel. So overall, we have done as a firm many M&A transactions, and both representing the targets and the buyers, and we can definitely help you, anyone on the call, anyone on the webinar, with this process. I just want to mention that in the due diligence, these are the main topics people have to know, which are unique to Israel. You have to figure out that the company was governed correctly and all the shares were issued properly, and there's no issues in the cap table. You have to see that the company complied with the Israeli employment laws, which there are many, many employment laws applying to the companies, and make sure the companies met the law and did not breach any of it. ESOP, employee stock option plan. So it's quite often, almost all the startups, the employees have stock options, which constitute something like between 10 to 15% of the shares of the company. So in the due diligence, we checked that the ESOP was constructed correctly and the options were granted correctly. So there's no issues and no surprises. If the company received the grants from the Israel Innovation Authority, we have to understand it and assess the cost of paying back these grants. The Innovation Authority, upon exit, is entitled to get back its grants. So we have to quantify what is the cost of these grants. We have to check the tax issues, and we have to make sure the company is compliant with all the cyber law and the privacy rules, especially if the company has data which has a lot of information about people. So these are kind of the key aspects on the due diligence of an Israeli company.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eyal.
So thank you very much. This was a very brief overview of doing business in Israel. I personally am very excited, as I mentioned, about the opportunity to work with new friends, and happy to answer any questions that may come up from the participants.
Thank you. I think we will have the question sections right now. Ines, would hand over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Eyal. Thank you, Mohamed Yassin. People are thanking you for the list of questions, and I have a question that was addressed to me, but I guess either Itai, Dr. Eyal, or Rand can answer it. They're asking about establishing a business in Israel. Do they need an Israeli business partner, like here in the UAE, or a foreigner can go to Israel and have and own 100% of his business?
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer. Eyal, unless you want to go ahead.
Go ahead. By all means,
just wanted you to rest for a bit.
Okay, no, go ahead. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. In Israel, it's actually very simple, and there is no requirement for having a local business partner. So the Israeli entity can be both, it can be foreign owned, and the directors, the board of directors of the company can be established by totally by 100% foreign directors.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much for this.
It's very, very simple and very easy.
All right, so we don't need a residency visa. A foreigner can come with a different nationality without having a residency visa and establish his business in Israel?
Yes, that's correct.
Because here in the UAE,
yeah, you can have 100% owned company, a company owned 100% by foreigners. Obviously,
here in
the
UAE, in order to establish your business, you will need in Israel.
Yeah, Ines, you are correct. In Israel, you can have a company which is wholly owned by foreigners. Obviously, I assume the company would have accountants in Israel, we have lawyers in Israel, we have employees in Israel, but it doesn't have to be owned by residents of Israel or even have a director from Israel. It can be 100% owned by investors from abroad, and all the directors can be from abroad. So it's very open and very accommodating.
I think we've got some connection issues, but I would be happy to continue on behalf of Ines. Perhaps another question that we find relevant is, are there different costs or different requirements for different activities in terms of companies like we have here in the UAE, or is it a standard license fee and you can pretty much pursue any activity? How is the licensing process for activities? And I'm sure there will be something about regulated activities versus non-regulated activities, but please let us know if you have this type of system in Israel.
I think, Ran, maybe you should answer this question.
Sure, happy to. So generally, the licensing fees are not significant in Israel. There is a certain requirement to pay certain fees. Companies pay an annual fee to the company's registrar, and partnerships to the company's to the partnerships registrar, and so on. And businesses actually establishing on-site operations will also have to pay a business license, which is usually paid to the local authority, to the municipal authority. We do have a limited number of regulated markets. The financial sector is regulated. The telecommunications sector is regulated. The energy and infrastructure sector is regulated. And in these cases, the licensing would not necessarily incur additional fees, but you would have to, if you want to have an ownership or holdings crossing a certain threshold in one of these, in an entity in one of these sectors, you would require a specific approval from the regulator. We do have very, very limited, in some of these sectors, we do have requirements for an Israeli resident to be part of the controlling group, but it's only if the intent is to control the entity, not just to be a shareholder. But other than that, I don't think that licensing is a big issue in Israel, whether or not compared to other jurisdictions.
For example, recently the Israeli airline El Al was sold, and there was a requirement that the owner would be an Israeli resident and not a foreign resident. That is a specific section regarding the airline. By the way, yesterday we were told that an investor from the United Arab Emirates offered to buy another airline in Israel called Israel. So here's the first transaction coming out of the Emirates. If I'm not mistaken, someone who was from a Jewish origin actually who was offering to buy this Israeli airline Israel. So again, there may be some regulation because it's an airline, but if it's a high-tech company or a services company, usually the licensing is not going to be a major issue.
Understood. Thank you for that. And in terms of what constitutes a national of Israel or resident of, do companies that are incorporated there qualify, or do they pierce through the corporate veil and actually look at the individual ultimate beneficial owners of the company? How is the system there?
So I will answer on the tax system in Israel. It's actually very similar to the US tax system. A company incorporated in Israel is taxable by Israel on a worldwide basis. All its income from Israel and outside of Israel. So it's a worldwide taxation of this company. The current tax rate in Israeli corporations is 23%. Many companies can qualify for a lower tax rate if they are so-called approved enterprise. And then the rates can be anywhere between 9% to 16%. In order to be an approved enterprise, you have to show that most of your income is from the exports. And also, if the company is in north of Israel or south of Israel, then the rates go down. If it's the center of Israel, it will be 16%. In the north or south, it will be 9%. But generally speaking, the corporate tax rate is 23%, which is relatively similar to what you would find in many other countries. The point is that Israel also imposes a dividend tax. When the company distributes dividends to its shareholders, there's an additional tax. If it's a local Israeli individual, the tax on the dividend would be 25 to 30%. If it's a non-resident of Israel, the dividend tax would be 25%, as I mentioned before, unless there is a tax treaty in place between Israel and the country of residence of that individual. And the treaties usually would reduce the tax rates to something between 5 to 15%. I'm quite certain there will be a treaty between Israel and the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, in say next year or two, and then the rates probably will go down for foreign investors from the Emirates. In practicality, many times investors can reduce their Israeli tax rate if they structure the investment through a loan. And then they can basically take back the loan amount tax-free because it's not a dividend, it's a repatriation of a loan. Also, on the interest, the company will get a deduction on the interest. So if you pay $100 in interest, so there will be no corporate tax. So we reduce the corporate tax. So there will be a tax on the interest, but it's not double taxation. It's only one level because the corporate tax goes down, the interest tax is payable. So if there is a transaction in which someone wants to buy or control 100% of an Israeli company, we can work together and find a way to basically maximize or minimize, if you will, maximize the tax savings or minimize the overall tax on the investor. One other point I want to mention is that someone who comes to Israel and stays in Israel on a permanent basis, an individual who stays in Israel on an ongoing basis is viewed as a resident of Israel on an individual tax basis. So it's not just a corporate tax, it's also an individual tax, and actually the individual tax on compensation income in Israel is quite high. The compensation tax could be up to 50%. So it's relatively high if you get a salary or consulting fee and you are a resident of Israel. Obviously, if someone from the Emirates gives consulting to an Israeli company or services to an Israeli company and gets paid, this will not be taxable by Israel because the services are outside of Israel and by non-Israeli residents. So you have to be very careful when you structure these transactions to avoid having an Israeli personal tax on the individual involved.
That's very useful. Thank you, Dr. Eyal. While we've got you here, I'll just have one question, and then we will wrap up. In terms of we've got a question from our attendees about tourism and in terms of this sector as a business, and how established is the tourism compared to the current pre accord with the UAE, and what are the processes for establishing a company or business in the tourism sector? Very briefly and very generally, nothing too specific. It's just a topic of interest at the moment.
Okay, I can say a few things. Number one, Israel is a great place to visit. Obviously, a relatively small country with many places to see. Just to highlight Jerusalem, obviously, and the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on the world, and Tel Aviv, and many other very exciting places. Obviously, the tourism industry in Israel is not as big as the high-tech industry. The high-tech is actually the driver of the Israeli economy. But before COVID-19, obviously we saw a very large increase in number of tourists coming to Israel. I think the number was several million. I don't have the statistic. I think it was 4 or 5 million in a year, which was much higher than in the past. A lot of it had to do because the policy allowed low-cost airlines to come to Israel, which brought a lot of people to come to Israel because the price of the airlines flight was cheaper than it was before. Unfortunately, the prices of the hotels in Israel overall are relatively high compared to what we find in other countries and what I read about in the Emirates. I think our prices are higher. Hotel prices are higher, at least they were pre-COVID. But I think overall, if someone wants to set up a tourist business in Israel, it's a very big opportunity. There are a lot of things that people can come and see here. I think relatively, even for if someone even comes for a few days, he can still see a lot of interesting places, very good food, very good restaurants. So I think there's a lot of opportunities on the tourist side, especially because of the geographical proximity, which is also, I think, a major factor. So hopefully we can find many tourists coming to Israel and visit us from your region. And I'm happy to let Ran or Itai, if you want to think and add any insights about this issue.
I think, Eyal, you put it correctly. The only one point I would add is I think, Israel being a very small country enables within a very, very short time, within one day, theoretically, you could cross from the green mountains of the Galilee until the desert in the south, passing through the shore and the beaches and the sea. and of course, Jerusalem and the other ancient sites in Israel. So there's a very big, I think, variety, enabling a very, very diverse short trip in a short time. And I think, I'm not sure if that's what the question referred to, but I think that there are talks, and it may have already been signed, there are talks of a bilateral visa-free travel arrangement between the UAE and Israel. Which means that UAE passport holders and Israeli passport holders will be able to enter the respective countries without obtaining a visa. If a visa is required for tourism, it's not a big deal. These things are done. But again, I think there's going to be a visa-free policy, so it'll be a non-issue.
And just one final thing that I'll add, because I think maybe if the question was referring to that. If the question is whether there are any regulatory limitations or requirements on setting up a tourism business in Israel, then there are not. So it's very easy to enter, to set up a travel agency, to hotels. Buying, selling hotels is something which is, other than the regular corporate requirements, there are no specific regulatory issues that need to be dealt with. So it's a great, it could potentially be a great opportunity for Emiratis looking to expand.
If I see the question, it was also about tourism from Israel to the Emirates. Maybe you can say about that. I think it's going to be a very big part of the cooperation between the countries. As you will see, Israelis like to travel and travel quite often. And I think the proximity and the fabulous pictures we see from Dubai and from Abu Dhabi and other places obviously would result in many Israelis coming over. And I think the tourism is kind of a two-way street, obviously. And I expect it's going to be a very big part of the relationship between the two countries. And even now, before it's fully open, a lot of people have already started traveling back and forth, and delegations coming in and out. Another point, which is obviously very important, is that the two countries are actually strategically located. If someone from Israel wants to fly to the Far East, then obviously landing in the Emirates is a good choice, and taking a connection flight with your fabulous airline, and vice versa. If someone wants to go from the Emirates to Europe or to the US or to other places, then Israel is a very good hub. So I expect the 24 weekly flights will not just be of tourists coming to visit the countries, but also people who are staying for a connection flight. And I think there's a very big potential here for this kind of travel and connections and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Ayal. Thank you, Itai. Thank you, Ran. And in terms of, you've basically outlined the issue in great detail. So really, that's we're very grateful for that. And one more question, and we can wrap up. It's to do with capital markets in Israel. In terms of IPO processes, the journey of the IPO, is it your typical journey that we see in the US, in the UK, or is there certain things that we in general must be aware of?
I would say, first of all, Israeli companies are actually, most of the exits are done by an M&A process. 90 out of the 150 transactions I mentioned a year, over 90, even 95% are by selling the company. So the number of IPOs is not as big as the number of M&As. This is an Israeli phenomenon, and people study it and research it and so on. Israeli companies have been able to go public all over the world. Actually, Israel is after in the US markets, Israel is the number 3 country. First of all, the US, number 2 is Canada, and number 3 Israel. So there are more Israeli companies on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange than any other country except Canada and the US, which is remarkable. but Israeli companies also went public in Australia, in Singapore, in Toronto, Canada, UK. So it's been very interesting ride over the last 25, 30 years to find the right market. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange is obviously a very well-known stock exchange. It has several hundred companies listed, both for trading equities and trading debt. Obviously, going public is always a complicated process, even for a local Israeli company, because very much like the US system, we adopted in Israel the US system for securities offerings. So just like in the US, in order to go public, you need to do a so-called prospectus and get it approved by the regulator, by the SEC. So in Israel, we have a similar process. We need to do a prospectus and get it approved by the Israeli Securities Authority. And the prospectus is obviously a very lengthy, a very detailed document talking about the company, its business, its risk factors, major contracts, everything that is material for an investor to know in the company. We are blessed in our firm, GKH, to have one of the leading, if not the leading, capital markets practice in Israel. So we often deal with this in prospectus requirement with the Israeli Securities Authority. So I think it's a possibility, and again, it's possible for Israeli company wholly owned by foreign people to be traded on Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. However, when you go public in Israel, there are often requirements to appoint two external directors, which are not part of the controlling party, and also independent directors. So there's a lot of regulation around going public in Israel, which is getting not so simple. One other thing we now have in Israel, which is interesting, and we didn't mention it, but I think it's interesting to note that we have a concept now called crowdfunding. And crowdfunding means that we have now in Israel quite a few portals which are internet based or web-based, and they post on their portal companies which are seeking to raise money. And people from all over the world can register to these portals, including residents of the Emirates can register on these portals and invest in the Israeli startups directly. So this is not a public company, it's a private company, but the fundraising is through a public mechanism of crowdfunding. So it's a very interesting and growing phenomenon. And we have several of these portals now in Israel, raising each of them probably several hundred millions a year for Israeli startups. So anyone on the webinar who wants to invest in Israeli startups, it's a very interesting way to get into Israeli startups. And obviously, we can happy to introduce to some of these portals. The other alternative is obviously to invest in private funds, and these private funds invest in startups directly. So it's also a possibility. So I think it's very diverse. You can do it to a public company, crowdfunding, venture capital, direct investment. It's a lot of ways to invest in Israel, and each one has its own benefits, but also its own risks and issues. So it's quite complicated, but we're happy to guide everybody through this maze once it becomes applicable.
Thank you, Dr. Eyal. Itai and Ran, if you would like to add something, let me know. If not, I think we are almost at our time, and we will wrap up. But I'll give you a few seconds to say a few words.
Well, I think maybe just to add, I started by saying it in Arabic, but for those who don't speak Arabic, so I just wanted to thank you once again, Mohammed, you and Ines and Hamdan Shamsi, of course, lawyers and legal consultants. Thanks very much for hosting us on this webinar. It's been a pleasure working with you thus far. And I think on behalf of Eyal and Itai and the rest of GKH, I can say that we have no doubt that we're looking forward to the many prospects that the Abraham Accords have opened also for us in the legal field, but of course for the entire general industries in both countries. And thanks again for hosting us.
absolutely a pleasure for us. I want to hand over to Itai.
I just wanted to I sign up to everything Ran said. So thank you for hosting us, and it's a very exciting times. Really is. Thank you.
First of all, again, I also join my colleagues in thanking you and Ines for setting this up. It was wonderful. I do want to say that one other point, one other angle is that recently the governments of Israel, the US, and the Emirates signed a contract, and the idea is to set up a fund of $3 billion to invest in joint ventures in the countries. I think this is a huge opportunity. I don't think the guidelines of the fund have been set up yet. I think it's still to be developed, but I think many businesses in Israel and the Emirates can do a joint venture. It doesn't have to be an investment in cash. It can also be exchange of technology or setting up jointly owned companies, 50-50, or any other mechanism, which can raise money from this trilateral fund. So this is another thing that will develop over time. Obviously, these are very exciting times. In Israel, we, in addition to the peace accord with the Emirates, we also signed a peace accord with Bahrain recently. And then last week, we were notified of a peace with Sudan. And people are saying that other countries are expected soon. So the world is changing. And for us, it's very exciting. And I'm sure there'll be much more we can do together. And I look forward to seeing everyone in person when COVID is less there and we can visit each other.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Itai. Thank you, Ran. We really enjoyed working with you to the period, ramp-up period towards this webinar, and we're very pleased, to have met you and your team and work with them. And we believe that as you guys are, our first contact with the legal industry, in Israel. You have been representing them very well and representing Israel in general, and giving a good example of how this Abrahamic Accord can be implemented between different stakeholders in both countries. So thank you very much. And on this note, I will wrap up. And hopefully we will see everyone from our attendees on our next webinar, which is doing business in UAE. And we invite you to attend and join that webinar to understand the same things we explained today about Israel, but about UAE. And that will take place on the 20th of October. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.